Collins, my wife's so-called alpha boss, showed up uninvited to my house, smug and ready to throw his weight around. He mocked me, taunted me about my marriage, and even dared to question my worth as a husband. But when he crossed the line one too many times, I snapped. Rage took over, and before I knew it, his arrogant smirk turned into a scream as I broke his hand in a moment of raw, unfiltered fury. He learned that day, this husband doesn't back down. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's next. Nathan sat at the edge of his bed, the familiar creak of the mattress beneath him somehow louder in the stillness of the room. His eyes wandered to the framed photo on the nightstand, a frozen moment from 10 years ago. In it, he and Emily stood on a windswept beach, her laughter caught mid-breath as he whispered something in her ear. They looked happy, vibrant, untouchable. He sighed, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Somewhere between then and now, that image had become a ghost of their reality. These days, they lived like polite strangers sharing a space. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by quiet nods and fleeting smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Breakfast that morning had been no different. Emily sat across the table, scrolling through her phone, her fingers tapping rapidly against the screen. Nathan watched her, his coffee growing cold as he wrestled with the words he wanted to say but couldn't. How was work? Are you okay? Do you still love me? Each question felt heavier than the last, so instead, he stirred his coffee and said nothing. Did you hear me? Emily's voice snapped him back to the moment. Huh? Nathan blinked, realizing she'd been speaking. I said I'll be late tonight, big project at work. Her tone was casual, almost rehearsed. She didn't look up, her attention fixed on the glowing screen in her hand. Late again? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. Is everything okay? It's fine, Nathan, she replied with a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. You know how it is. He didn't know how it was, not anymore. Work used to be something they talked about over dinner, laughing at office politics and bad coffee in break rooms. Now, it felt like a wall between them, a fortress she'd built, brick by brick, to keep him out. As she stood and grabbed her bag, the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, something new, floral but sharp. It tugged at his senses, a whisper of something he couldn't place. He wanted to ask her about it, but swallowed the words, letting them dissolve with the lump in his throat. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Nathan alone with the silence. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty seat across from him. They say trust is the foundation of any marriage, but what happens when cracks start to form? He stared into the depths of his coffee, the swirling liquid mirroring the storm inside him. Somewhere deep down, Nathan already knew, those cracks had started to spread. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Nathan stood by the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup. The rhythmic clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug seemed to echo louder than it should have. Across the room, Emily sat at the breakfast table, her phone in hand, completely absorbed. Nathan watched her, the light from the screen casting a pale glow on her face. Her hair was loosely tied back, and she wore the soft sweater he'd bought her last Christmas. But something about her seemed untouchable, far removed from the woman he thought he knew. Breaking the silence, he cleared his throat and carried his mug to the table. "You want me to toast some bagels?" he asked, trying to inject some warmth into the otherwise chilly atmosphere. Emily shook her head, not looking up. "No, I'll just grab something on the way to work," she murmured, her thumb scrolling steadily. Nathan sat down across from her, sipping his coffee. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words stuck. The room felt heavy, weighted by the unspoken tension between them. Trying again, he ventured cautiously. "Busy day ahead?" She nodded, still not meeting his gaze. "Yeah, lots to get done. The deadline's next week, and Collins wants everything perfect." There it was again, his name. Collins. The way she said it, with just a hint of deference, made Nathan's stomach twist. He'd heard it often lately, woven casually into their sparse conversations, yet it carried a weight that unsettled him. "Collins seems to keep you on your toes," Nathan said, attempting to sound casual. This time, Emily glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. "He's demanding, but it's his job to push us. That's how we get results." Then, as if the conversation required no further elaboration, she returned her attention to her phone. Nathan studied her for a moment, noticing things he hadn't before. The faint crease between her brows when she concentrated on the screen, the slight upward curl of her lips like she was reading something amusing. He felt a pang of something bitter and unnameable. Scott said, "You've been working late a lot," he ventured, his tone light but probing. Emily's eyes flicked toward him, her smile faint and fleeting. "It's just the season. You know how it is." But he didn't know. Not anymore. Not in this version of their life where conversations felt like negotiations and every smile seemed like a performance. As the minutes dragged on, the silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. Nathan pushed back his chair, the screech against the floor startling in the quiet. "I'll head out," he said, standing and grabbing his keys. Emily looked up then, blinking as if coming out of a daze. "Okay," she said simply, her voice soft but distant. Nathan lingered for a moment, searching her face for some trace of familiarity, of the woman who used to light up their mornings with laughter and shared plans. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of her phone vibrating against the table as she turned back to it. With a sigh, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound echoed in his chest, hollow and final, as if marking the start of a day he no longer recognized. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, the mood was noticeably lighter. Emily had come home in good spirits, her face brighter than it had been in days. Nathan took it as a small victory, a fleeting return to normalcy. "And went well today," Emily said, twirling her fork absent-mindedly in her pasta. "Collins really liked the proposal I presented. He said it was exactly what he was looking for." Nathan looked up from his plate, caught off guard by the enthusiasm in her voice. "That's great," he replied, though his tone was more tentative than celebratory. "You've mentioned him a lot lately." Her gaze flicked to his for a moment before she shrugged casually. "He's the boss, everything has to go through him." There was nothing particularly unusual about her words, but it was the way she said his name, Collins, that stuck with Nathan. There was a subtle warmth in her tone, a softness that didn't quite belong in a conversation about work. Hoping to push the thought aside, he smiled and reached for his glass. "Sounds like he's got high expectations." Emily nodded, taking a sip of water. "He does. But that's what makes him such a good leader. He knows how to get the best out of people." Nathan forced a chuckle, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "Just don't let him work you too hard. I like having you home sometimes too." She laughed lightly, but the sound didn't settle him the way it used to. Instead, it felt distant, as though it wasn't meant for him at all. The conversation shifted after that, drifting into safer, less significant territory. But as Nathan cleared the dishes later, her words, and the way she'd said them, lingered in his mind. It was nothing, he told himself, just a harmless observation. And yet, deep down, he couldn't quite let it go. The clock ticked past midnight when Nathan heard the front door creak open. He'd been sitting on the couch, the glow of the muted TV casting long shadows across the room. Emily's footsteps were soft, almost cautious, as she entered the house. "Hey," she said, her voice light but slightly strained. "You're still up?" Nathan glanced at her, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. How was work?" She slipped off her heels and set them by the door, her movements deliberate. It was fine, just a long day. Without waiting for a response, she crossed the room and leaned down to kiss him on the cheek, the faint scent of her perfume wafting past him. Nathan froze. It wasn't her usual fragrance. Emily always wore a subtle floral scent, something understated. This was different, sharper and heavier. For a moment, he couldn't place it, but it tugged at his senses in a way that made his chest tighten. "You changed your perfume?" he asked casually, hoping to keep his tone even. Emily paused, her jacket halfway off. "Oh no," she said with a quick laugh. Must have been someone at work. You know how it is in close quarters. Nathan nodded slowly, but his mind was already racing. She draped her jacket over the back of the chair, the fabric brushing against his hand as she walked past. The scent clung to it, faint but unmistakable. He inhaled subtly, the unfamiliar perfume raising a quiet alarm in the back of his mind. The next morning, as he stood by the chair staring at her jacket, he found himself replaying the conversation from the night before. It could have been nothing. But then again, it could have been something. And now, that something wouldn't let him go. The following weekend, Nathan found himself alone in the house while Emily stepped out to run errands. She'd left her phone charging on the kitchen counter, something she rarely did. Normally, it was always within her reach, like an extension of her hand. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, focusing instead on finishing the dishes. But as the minutes passed, the screen lit up with a notification. He glanced over, intending to ignore it, but the name on the screen made his breath catch. Collins. A knot formed in his stomach as the message previewed briefly before disappearing. You looked stunning yesterday. Can't wait to see you Monday. The words lingered in his mind, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. This is how it feels when there is nothing between us. For a moment, he stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Part of him wanted to grab the phone, scroll through it, and find more. But another part, the part still clinging to trust, urged him to step away. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. His heartbeat quickened as he weighed his options. If he looked, he'd be crossing a line. If he didn't, he'd spend the rest of the day haunted by the possibility of what he might find. Finally, he took a step closer, his fingers hovering over the phone. The screen lit up again, as if tempting him further. This time, it wasn't a message, just the lock screen. A photo of the two of them from their anniversary trip last year. The contrast between that image and the words he just read made his chest tighten. Emily's voice broke the spell as she returned home, her keys jangling in the door. Nathan quickly stepped back, his heart pounding as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. Hey, she said, walking into the kitchen. Everything okay? He forced a smile, wiping his hands on a towel. Yeah, just finishing up here. Emily didn't seem to notice his unease as she picked up her phone and glanced at it. Her expression didn't change, no flicker of guilt or hesitation. She slipped the device into her bag and began chatting about her errands as if nothing had happened. Nathan nodded along, his responses automatic. Inside, though, his mind was racing. Should he confront her? Demand an explanation? But what if he was wrong? What if there was an innocent context he didn't know? That night, as Emily slept soundly beside him, Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The message replayed in his mind, each word a fresh jab at his growing doubt. He tried to reason with himself, to push the suspicion aside, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let him rest. You looked stunning yesterday. Can't wait to see you Monday. The words echoed in the quiet, casting shadows over the fragile trust he'd been holding on to. For the first time, Nathan felt the weight of something he couldn't ignore, something that threatened to unravel everything they had built. The next evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Nathan decided to test the waters. The message from Collins had been gnawing at him, its implications impossible to ignore. He'd spent the entire day rehearsing how to approach the subject without sounding accusatory. "A busy day?" he asked, keeping his tone light as he speared a piece of chicken on his fork. Emily looked up briefly, offering a small smile. "Yeah, non-stop meetings. You know how it is." Nathan nodded, pretending to focus on his plate. "I've been hearing a lot about Collins lately," he said casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "He must really rely on you." There was the faintest hesitation in her movement before she responded. "He's the boss. It's kind of his job to keep us all busy." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "Does he usually send compliments? Like the one about looking stunning?" Emily's fork clattered against her plate as she set it down, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "What are you talking about?" "I saw the message," Nathan said evenly, his voice steady but firm. "It popped up on your phone." Her cheeks flushed, but her voice remained calm if defensive. "It's nothing, Nathan. He's just being friendly. That's how he is." Nathan's brow furrowed as he leaned forward. "Friendly?" "Emily, that didn't sound like a professional message. It sounded personal." Emily let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're reading too much into it. He compliments everyone. It doesn't mean anything." The tension in the room thickened, the silence between them charged with unspoken accusations. Nathan's jaw tightened as he searched her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. Instead, she seemed more annoyed than anything else. "You've been distant lately," he said after a pause, his voice quieter now. "I feel like I don't even know what's going on in your life anymore." Emily shook her head, pushing her chair back slightly. "I've just been busy, Nathan. Work has been stressful, and I don't need you jumping to conclusions on top of everything else." "So, I'm the problem now?" Nathan asked, his frustration breaking through the calm facade. "I'm not the one sending flirtatious texts?" Her eyes narrowed as she stood, grabbing her plate. "I'm not doing this with you right now. If you can't trust me, that's on you." Nathan watched her retreat to the kitchen, his stomach twisting with anger and disbelief. The sound of running water filled the silence, but it did little to drown out the bitter echo of their conversation. For a moment, he considered pressing the issue further, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't ready to talk. Or maybe she just didn't want to. Either way, Nathan was left with the sinking realization that the cracks in their marriage were deeper than he'd imagined. 2 days after their tense dinner conversation, Nathan sat at his desk, scrolling through emails. Most were mundane: work updates, newsletters, and the occasional spam message. But one stood out, its subject line vague: "For your eyes only." Curious, but cautious, Nathan clicked on it. The sender's address was unfamiliar, a jumble of characters with no name attached. The email itself was brief, but sent a chill down his spine. "Nathan, I don't know you, but I've seen enough to know you deserve the truth. Collins has a reputation for pursuing women in the office, especially the married ones. Emily's not the first. Be careful. Watch your back." The words seemed to leap off the screen, each one driving home the unease he'd been trying to suppress. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a wave of anger. Who would send this? Was it a cruel prank? Or could there be some truth to it? He reread the email, his mind racing. The mention of Colin's reputation struck a nerve. Nathan thought back to Emily's late nights, her guarded phone, and the way she spoke about her boss with an almost imperceptible reverence. It all lined up in a way he couldn't ignore. His hands tightened around the edge of his desk. The anonymous nature of the message only added to its weight. Someone in Emily's office must have seen something, enough to reach out to him, risking their anonymity. Nathan debated his next move. Should he confront Emily directly, armed with this new information, or would that only push her further away? The email was vague, offering no concrete evidence, only a warning that amplified his suspicions. As he sat back in his chair, Nathan felt the familiar sting of doubt, mixed with a growing sense of resolve. Whoever had sent this wasn't just meddling, they were trying to tell him something important. The cracks in his marriage were no longer just figments of his imagination. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility he'd been avoiding. What if it's all true? The email had opened a floodgate Nathan wasn't prepared for. Sitting alone in the dim light of his study, he turned over every moment in his mind, each memory now cast in a different light. He thought back to the early days of their marriage, how effortless it had all seemed. They had shared everything: dreams, fears, even the smallest details of their days. Emily would text him little updates throughout her workday, and they'd spend evenings curled up on the couch, talking about anything and everything. And then the conversation would begin. But those moments had faded, gradually at first, like a song growing quieter until it disappeared altogether. Nathan hadn't noticed the shift when it began. It was in the small things, the way she'd stopped asking about his day, or how she'd started falling asleep with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. He told himself it was normal, that marriage went through phases, but now, in the shadow of that anonymous warning, those small changes felt monumental. Nathan's mind drifted to her late nights, the ones she'd brushed off with vague explanations about work deadlines. He'd wanted to believe her, to trust that her absences were innocent, but now he replayed each excuse, searching for cracks he had willfully ignored. There was the perfume, too, that unfamiliar scent lingering on her jacket that night. He had dismissed it, convincing himself it was nothing, just a fleeting anomaly. Now it felt like a breadcrumb in a trail leading to a truth he didn't want to confront. As the pieces came together, Nathan's chest tightened. Each memory, each clue was another weight pressing down on him. He didn't want to be the kind of man who doubted his wife, who searched for hidden meanings in her words and actions. But the signs were there, undeniable and growing louder with every passing day. He stood and paced the room, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts flickered to their most recent argument, the way she had deflected and turned the blame back on him. Was that guilt? Or was it frustration born from his baseless suspicions? The lines between truth and doubt blurred in his mind, leaving him stranded in a limbo of uncertainty. Then there was the email. Its words echoed in his mind, fueling his inner conflict. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't read it, but another part, a quieter, sharper voice, urged him to face the reality he'd been avoiding. Finally, he sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. He loved Emily. That much he knew. But love alone wasn't enough to silence the growing doubt in his heart. For the first time, he admitted to himself that their marriage wasn't what it once was. And maybe, just maybe, it never would be again. Nathan stood in front of the sleek glass building, its towering presence only adding to the weight in his chest. His heart pounded as he pushed open the door and stepped into the marble-limbed lobby. The air inside was crisp, almost sterile, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. The receptionist barely glanced up as he approached. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice disinterested. "I'm here to see Collins," Nathan replied, his tone firm but calm. The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "And you are?" "Nathan," he said simply. "He'll know why I'm here." Her brows furrowed slightly, but she picked up the phone, muttering into the receiver. A moment later, she gestured toward the elevators. "Top floor. He's expecting you." Nathan's jaw tightened as he stepped into the elevator, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored walls. He straightened his posture, forcing himself to appear composed, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had replayed this moment in his mind all night, crafting and discarding countless approaches. Now, there was no turning back. The elevator doors opened to reveal a sleek office space, all glass walls and minimalist furniture. Collins' assistant greeted him with a tight smile and motioned toward the corner office. The door was slightly ajar, and Nathan caught a glimpse of the man he'd been dreading to face. Collins sat behind a massive desk, his chair tilted back as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up as Nathan entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to a smug grin. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, leaning back further in his chair. "What can I do for you, Mr. Scott?" Nathan shut the door behind him, the sound echoing sharply in the otherwise quiet space. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. Collins gestured lazily to the chair across from him. "By all means, have a seat." "I'll stand," Nathan replied, his eyes never leaving Collins. Collins shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Suit yourself. What's on your mind?" Nathan took a step closer, his jaw tight. "Stay away from my wife." For a brief moment, Collins' expression faltered, but it was quickly replaced with a smirk. "Ha, Emily. She's quite something, isn't she? You're a lucky man." The deliberate nonchalance in his tone made Nathan's blood boil. "This isn't a joke, Collins. I know what's going on." "And what exactly do you think you know?" Collins asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're grasping at straws." Nathan clenched his fists, resisting the urge to lunge across the desk. "You're crossing lines, and you know it. I'm here to tell you it stops now." Collins chuckled, leaning forward slightly. "Nathan, let me give you a piece of advice. If your wife is spending time with me, maybe you should ask yourself why. A man like me doesn't chase. Women come to me because they're looking for something they're not getting at home. The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Whatever power trip you're on, it ends here. You don't call her, you don't text her, and you sure as hell don't try to see her outside of work. Collins leaned back again, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You're angry, I get it. But let me ask you this. Do you think confronting me is going to fix whatever's broken between you two? Nathan's vision blurred with rage, but he held his ground. What's broken is your sense of decency. You prey on people's vulnerabilities like it's a game. Well, this game is over. For the first time, Collins' expression darkened, his arrogance faltering slightly. You don't scare me, Nathan, and honestly, you should be thanking me. I've probably done more to keep your marriage alive than you have. Nathan's restraint snapped. He slammed his hands on the desk, leaning in so close that Collins flinched. This is your only warning, he growled. You stay away from my wife, or you'll find out just how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. Collins's smug facade cracked, but he quickly recovered, straightening his tie. Message received, he said, his voice steady but strained. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Nathan stepped back, his fists still clenched. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he let out a shaky breath. The confrontation had left him shaken, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. Nathan sat in the living room, his foot tapping anxiously against the hardwood floor. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emily was upstairs, likely sensing the storm brewing below. After the confrontation with Collins, Nathan knew he couldn't let things fester any longer. When Emily finally descended the stairs, her expression was wary, as if she already knew what was coming. She paused at the bottom step, her arms folded across her chest. You're upset, she said cautiously. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Upset doesn't quite cover it, he replied, standing to face her. I went to see Collins today. Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing. You what? I needed to hear it from him, Nathan said, his voice tight. He didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed to enjoy taunting me about what's been going on between the two of you. Emily's face flushed with anger, or was it guilt? I can't believe you'd confront him like that, she snapped. What gives you the right? What gives me the right? Nathan's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. I'm your husband, Emily. I have every right to know why you've been sneaking around, lying to me, and, what, building some secret relationship with your boss? Emily flinched but didn't back down. It's not what you think, she said, her tone defensive. Yes, I've been spending time with him, but it's not— Don't lie to me, Nathan interrupted, his voice breaking. Not anymore. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Emily's shoulders sagged and she looked away, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. Nathan froze, the air seeming to leave the room. Didn't mean for what to happen? She hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of the chair. It started as talking, that's all. He was there when I felt like no one else was, when I felt invisible at home. Nathan's chest tightened, her words cutting deeper than he expected. So what? You turned to him because I wasn't good enough? It wasn't about that, she snapped, her voice rising with frustration. It was about feeling like I mattered to someone again, like I wasn't just existing. And that led to, what? Flirting? Secrets? A full-blown affair? Nathan's voice cracked, his emotions spilling out in a torrent of anger and pain. Emily looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't plan it, Nathan, she said, her voice trembling. But yes, I crossed lines I shouldn't have. At first it was emotional. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, but then it became more. Nathan stepped back, as if her words had physically struck him. His hands trembled, his breath coming in uneven gasps. "You cheated on me," he said, more to himself than to her. "You let it happen." Emily took a hesitant step forward, her hands outstretched as if to calm him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't know how to tell you." Nathan's mind raced, replaying every moment over the past few months. Every late night, every excuse, every moment of distance, it all made sense now. He looked at her, his eyes filled with both anger and despair. "How long?" he asked quietly. She hesitated before answering. "A few months." "And was it just once?" he pressed, his voice sharp. "Or was it—" "Twice," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It happened twice, and I hated myself for it both times." Nathan turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the table for support. He felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. "Why are you even here?" he asked bitterly. "Why didn't you just leave if I wasn't enough for you?" "I didn't want to leave," Emily cried, her voice desperate. "I love you, Nathan. I was stupid, and I made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You've got a funny way of showing it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily wiped at her tears, her voice soft and pleading. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm here because I want to fix this. I want us to work. Please, Nathan." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. The weight of her betrayal bore down on him, but beneath the anger, there was something else, a flicker of hope, however faint. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he said finally. "I don't know if I even want to." Emily's tears fell harder, but she nodded, accepting his words. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm sorry, that I still love you." Nathan didn't respond. Instead, he walked past her and up the stairs, leaving her alone in the quiet of the living room. For now, he needed space. Space to process the wreckage of their relationship and decide whether it was worth salvaging. It was late evening when the knock came at the door. Nathan, still nursing the emotional storm from his conversation with Emily, had been sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television. The sound startled him, sharp and unexpected. He rose slowly, a flicker of unease settling in his chest. When he opened the door, his unease turned to disbelief. Standing on the porch, looking entirely too smug for the situation, was Collins. "Mind if I come in?" Collins asked, his tone casual, almost mocking. Nathan's grip tightened on the doorframe. "What the hell are you doing here?" he growled. Collins smirked, adjusting his expensive jacket. "Relax. I just came to talk. Thought we could clear the air." Nathan stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "We have nothing to talk about," he said coldly. "You've already done enough damage." Collins raised an eyebrow, his expression unrepentant. "You mean the truth? Is that what's bothering you, Nathan? Because from where I stand, I didn't make her cheat. She came to me." Those words were a match to Nathan's already frayed nerves. His fists clenched at his sides as he tried to steady his breathing. "Get off my property before I do something you'll regret." But Collins didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a taunting whisper. "You're angry at the wrong person, Nathan. If she was happy, she wouldn't have needed me. Maybe you should think about that." Nathan's vision blurred with rage, and before he could stop himself, his fist connected with Collins' jaw. The force of the punch sent Collins stumbling back, his smug demeanor crumbling as he clutched his face. "You've got a temper," Collins spat, straightening himself with a sneer. No wonder she was looking for something else. That was the final straw. Nathan lunged at him, grabbing his arm in a tight grip. Collins tried to pull away, but Nathan twisted his wrist sharply, a sickening crack filling the air. Collins cried out in pain, his face contorted in shock and fury. Nathan released him, stepping back as Collins cradled his broken wrist. "I warned you," Nathan said, his voice shaking with both rage and restraint. "You don't come near her again. Not to call, not to text, and sure as hell not to show up here. Do you understand me?" Collins glared at him, his breath ragged from the pain. "You're insane," he hissed, This isn't over. Nathan's jaw tightened, his own hands trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. "Oh, it's over," he said, his voice firm. "You walk away now, or you leave in worse shape than you already are." Collins staggered off the porch, his glare burning into Nathan as he retreated to his car. He fumbled to open the door with his uninjured hand, muttering curses under his breath, before driving away. As the taillights disappeared down the street, Nathan remained rooted to the spot, his chest heaving. The night air was cold against his skin, but the fire in his veins refused to settle. When he finally went back inside, Emily stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she asked softly. Nathan didn't look at her as he walked past, his voice low and unsteady. "I handled it." Emily didn't press further, but the weight of the encounter hung heavy in the house. Nathan poured himself a drink, his hands still trembling as he stared out the window. Collins was gone, but the damage he'd left behind wasn't so easily banished. For now, though, Nathan could only hope the message had been received. The morning after the confrontation, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with unspoken words. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous night in a relentless loop. Emily entered the room hesitantly, her footsteps soft, as though she feared breaking the fragile silence between them. She placed a folder on the table in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. "I quit my job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan looked up, surprised. "What?" She took a deep breath, pulling out a resignation letter from the folder. "I handed this in first thing this morning. I've blocked Colin's number too. I'm done with that job, and I'm done with him." Nathan stared at the letter, his emotions a tangled mess. Relief, anger, and a lingering sense of betrayal all fought for dominance. "And what am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his tone edged with bitterness. Emily sat across from him, her eyes pleading. "You're supposed to see that I'm trying, Nathan. I know I messed up, more than I can ever put into words. But I'm not giving up on us." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You think quitting your job fixes everything? That it erases what you did?" "No," Emily said quickly, shaking her head. "I know it doesn't, but it's a start. I needed to cut him out of my life completely, and this was the only way." The sincerity in her voice gave Nathan pause, but his defenses remained up. "So now you want forgiveness?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "After everything?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't expect it overnight. I know I have to earn it, and if I have to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm sorry, I will. But please, Nathan, don't shut me out. Let me try." He studied her for a long moment, searching her face for any hint of deceit or insincerity. Instead, he saw raw guilt and desperation. It was clear she was bearing everything, hoping against hope that he would let her back in. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Emily. Trust isn't something you just rebuild. It takes time." "I'll wait," she said softly. "As long as it takes." Her words hung in the air, a tentative olive branch in the midst of their wreckage. For the first time in weeks, Nathan felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It was buried deep beneath the layers of pain and anger, but it was there. "I guess we'll see," he said finally, his tone cautious but not dismissive. Emily nodded, wiping her tears. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a start. A fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang, pulling Nathan from his thoughts. He hadn't been expecting anyone, and the sound startled him. Setting down his mug, he walked to the door and opened it to find a plain brown envelope sitting on the welcome mat. No return address, no markings, just his name scrawled across the front in shaky, uneven handwriting.
Frowning, he picked it up and closed the door behind him. Back in the kitchen, he sat down and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several glossy photos and a folded note. As he pulled out the contents, his breath caught in his throat. The photos were of Emily and Collins, They weren't obscene, but they didn't need to be. One showed them sitting at a cafe, their faces close as they talked, Emily smiling in a way that made Nathan's stomach churn. Another captured them walking side by side in the parking lot, Colin's hand resting lightly on her lower back. The most damning one was blurry but unmistakable. Emily and Collins embracing outside his car, her face turned toward his as if they were about to kiss. It was if they were about to kiss. Nathan's hands trembled as he stared at the images. The raw emotions he had been trying to bury, anger, betrayal, despair, surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. His vision blurred as he unfolded the note, the sharp, slanted handwriting cutting into him like a blade. You may forgive her, but don't forget who she really is. She betrayed you once, she'll do it again. The words felt like poison sinking deep into his mind. Nathan dropped the note onto the table and sat back, his heart pounding. He had been trying to move forward, trying to believe that Emily's efforts to repair their relationship were genuine. But now, these photos and the venomous message reopened every wound. For several minutes, he sat frozen, torn between the love he still felt for Emily and the crushing weight of betrayal. The photos were old, he realized. They had to be from months ago. But that didn't lessen the pain or the doubt they sowed. Could he ever truly forgive her? Could he ever trust her again? Nathan clenched his fists, the edges of the photos curling beneath his tightening grip. The note's warning echoed in his mind, testing the fragile resolve he had only just begun to build. The small counseling office was cozy but unassuming, with beige walls and 2 chairs angled toward a love seat. Nathan sat on one end of the couch, his arms crossed defensively, while Emily sat on the other, her hands folded in her lap. The air between them was thick with tension, but both were there. A small step, though neither was sure where it would lead. The therapist, a calm woman in her mid-50s named Dr. Turner, began with a soft but direct tone. You've both been through a lot. I want to create a space where we can unpack the pain and, if you're willing, start to rebuild. But this will take honesty, patience, and time. Are you both ready for that? Nathan hesitated, glancing at Emily, whose eyes were fixed on the carpet. Finally, he nodded. I don't know if I'm ready, but I'll try. Emily looked up, her voice barely audible. Me too. Dr. Turner leaned forward slightly. Good. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Emily, what do you believe led to the breakdown in your relationship? Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I felt invisible, she admitted, like I wasn't needed or noticed anymore. Collins, he made me feel seen, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. It was selfish and wrong, but at the time, I convinced myself it filled a void. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Dr. Turner turned to him. Nathan, how does that make you feel? Ah! He let out a sharp breath. Angry, he said bluntly. And hurt. I was here, doing everything I thought I was supposed to, working hard, trying to provide, and instead of talking to me, she found someone else. Emily's voice broke as she responded. I tried to talk, Nathan, so many times, but it always felt like you were too busy or too tired to really listen. Nathan shook his head, his frustration evident. You could have said something. I would have made time. Dr. Turner gently. This is a common pattern in relationships. Both partners feel unheard, and instead of addressing it, the distance grows. Emily, how could you have approached Nathan differently? And Nathan, how could you have shown more presence? Emily wiped her eyes, her voice shaky. I should have been direct instead of expecting him to read my mind. I should have told him how lonely I felt. Nathan hesitated, his voice softer this time. Maybe I got too caught up in everything else. Work, responsibilities. I stopped seeing the signs because I thought we were fine. Dr. Turner nodded. Acknowledging that is important. You both played roles in the breakdown, even if the betrayal is what stands out now. But healing starts with accountability and understanding, not blame. Over the next few sessions, the layers of their pain began to peel back. Nathan admitted that he had withdrawn emotionally over the years, often taking their relationship for granted. Emily, in turn, confessed to not expressing her needs clearly and allowing her feelings of neglect to fester. Dr. Turner guided them through exercises and communication, teaching them to listen without interrupting and to validate each other's feelings. At first, it felt mechanical, almost forced, but slowly they began to open up in ways they hadn't in years.
One evening during a session, Emily turned to Nathan with tears in her eyes. I know I broke us, and I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But I'm here because I believe in us. I'm here because I love you. Nathan looked at her, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, he admitted, his voice raw. But I want to try. I miss what we had. I miss us. Dr. Turner smiled faintly. That's progress. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to move forward despite it. And that choice has to be made every single day. In the weeks that followed, Nathan and Emily began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when the pain still felt fresh, but they learned to lean into the discomfort, to face it together instead of retreating into silence. The trust they were rebuilding was fragile, but it was there, a small, flickering flame in the darkness. For the first time in months, there was hope. Not a guarantee, but a possibility. And for Nathan and Emily, that was enough to keep trying. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind that felt suspended in time. The soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen was the only sound in the house. Nathan sat on the couch, a book in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. His thoughts had drifted again, as they often did lately, to the fragile state of his marriage. The past weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions. Counseling had helped, but the scars of betrayal weren't so easily smoothed over. Trust was a fragile thing. Once shattered, it could never be restored to its original state. And yet, he was still here, still trying. Some days, he wasn't even sure why. Emily entered the living room quietly, holding a large, leather-bound scrapbook. She hesitated in the doorway, as if gathering her courage, before walking over to him. I have something for you, she said softly. Nathan looked up, his brow furrowed. What is it?
She sat down beside him, placing the scrapbook on the coffee table. I've been working on this, she explained, her voice trembling slightly. It's something to show you how much I still care, how much I want us to work.
Curious but cautious, Nathan opened the book. The first page greeted him with a photo of their wedding day, Emily's radiant smile mirrored by his own. Below it, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "The day we promised to choose each other, every day, no matter what." He turned the pages slowly, each one carefully curated with pictures, mementos, and small notes. Their first apartment, their honeymoon in the mountains, lazy Sundays spent laughing over burnt pancakes. It was all there. A timeline of their love before it had been tested. Halfway through, he stopped at a page that caught him off guard. It was a photo of them holding hands at a park, taken by a friend. Beneath it, Emily had written, "This was the moment I realized I didn't just love you. I needed you." Nathan's throat tightened, his fingers brushing the edge of the photo. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Because I want you to know that I still choose you, Nathan, every day, even when it's hard, even when I don't know if you'll choose me back. I need you to see that I'm willing to fight for us." Nathan closed the book gently, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He looked at her, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with, but also the woman who had hurt him. Both existed in the same person, and that was the hardest part. "I appreciate this," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "But this doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't fix everything." Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know it doesn't, but it's a start, and I'll keep starting every day, as long as you let me."
For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hung heavy between them. But then Nathan reached out and placed his hand over hers. It wasn't a declaration or a promise, but it was something.
"Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "It's something I have to choose every day. Some days it's harder than others." Emily nodded, her fingers tightening around his. "I'll be here for all the hard days," she said. "If you'll have me." Nathan looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Not for what they had been, but for what they might become. "We'll see," he said honestly, his tone neither cold nor warm. It was real, and that was enough. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, Nathan turned back to the scrapbook, flipping through more pages. Emily stayed by his side, silently hopeful. The road ahead would be long, filled with uncertainty and struggle, but in that moment, they had taken one more step forward. And sometimes, a step was all you needed to keep going.